Hi everybody, welcome to 6.4 Gas Exchange. This is my video lecture. So the essential idea here is that the lungs are actively ventilated to ensure that gas exchange can occur passively, right? So we're going to be speaking a lot about just how do we get the air into the lungs? What are the structures leading to the lungs and what are the structures of the lungs? What is ventilation? Okay, and what is that gas exchange that's occurring passively through diffusion? As always, have a look at the understandings statements and the applications and skills statements. Just give them a read through and see if any stand out to you as ones that you would want to focus on for this subtopic. The main parts of the ventilation system that you need to know about are the trachea, which is that cartilage, rings of cartilage. It's a tube that's made up of rings of cartilage. So your air, as you're breathing in, is going to start obviously through your mouth or nose into your pharynx and then larynx, and then it hits your trachea. The trachea then splits off, and that's where we have the bronchi. The bronchi is where the trachea splits off. The bronchioles is where the bronchi split off further again. And then finally we get to the alveoli, which are the tiny sac-like structures. They look like little balloons, and when they're all together, they kind of look like grapes. So over here you can see they kind of look like grapes. Some other important things to know about the ventilation system is about the muscles involved with all of this. So the diaphragm right here is one of the most important muscles. It's when it contracts, it actually flattens. So in its relaxed state, that's what it would look like right here in this diagram. And then when it contracts, it flattens. And so when it flattens, you could imagine it's actually pulling down on your chest cavity and your lungs so that it's creating a decrease in pressure, which then pulls the air in through your nose or mouth. Some other muscles that you're going to want to know about are the external and internal intercostal muscles. And so on this diagram here, you can see you've got your lungs over here on the right side, and then you've got on the outside of your ribs the external intercostal muscles, and then more on the inside are the internal intercostal muscles. And so those actually work with each other to pull your rib cage out, which again is going to create a larger volume in your chest cavity, just like when the diaphragm contracts, creates a larger volume in your chest cavity, which then decreases the pressure and allows air to be pulled in through your trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, and finally getting to the alveoli. So ventilation is simply just that movement of the air into and out of the lungs, okay? And it happens in two different phases, inspiration and expiration. For ventilation, the air is now going to be in the alveoli, and there's going to be a gas exchange that occurs. So you've got oxygen traveling from inside the alveoli into the capillaries that are surrounding the alveoli. You've also got the CO2, that is the waste product from all of your blood that's being carried there in the veins right here, the venules or the capillaries that are veins, and that is going to be transferred from the veins into the alveoli so that you can then expire and breathe out that waste product, the CO2. The oxygen that got transferred into the arterioles or the capillaries that are arteries would be transported by the erythrocytes, the red blood cells, to all of your tissues, and your tissues would then be absorbing and exchanging that gas again and absorbing the oxygen so that they can go through cellular respiration. So let's go through that again. You're ventilating, bringing air into your lungs. There's a gas exchange happening there where oxygen is being taken from the air and put into your bloodstream. The CO2 from your deoxygenated blood is also being exchanged, but it's going the opposite direction, passively through diffusion into the alveoli so that it can be expired and breathed out as a waste product. Let's keep following where the oxygenated blood would go if it was traveling to, for example, your muscle tissue. So your muscle tissues would contain a lot of mitochondria because they are very active tissues and require a lot of energy. And mitochondria, as you know, through the process of cellular respiration, is going to be producing that ATP energy from the oxygen. Okay, so you're supposed to know that ventilation, that movement of the air into and out of the lungs, does maintain concentration gradients of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the air in the alveoli and the blood flowing in adjacent capillaries. So this is just saying that ventilation's allowing for that concentration gradient, right? The difference in concentration to exist so that passive diffusion can happen. So there would be a high concentration of oxygen in the alveoli and a low concentration of oxygen in the deoxygenated blood. There's a high concentration of CO2 in the deoxygenated blood and a low concentration of CO2 in the alveoli. Due to these concentration gradients, the CO2 is going to passively diffuse from the alveoli, from the deoxygenated blood to the alveoli. The oxygen with the high concentration gradient in the alveoli is going to diffuse passively into your erythrocytes, your red blood cells. This slide is just giving a brief overview of different ventilation systems in different organisms. So smaller organisms like flatworms, protists, and bacteria are so small that they can actually just directly exchange gases with their surroundings. So for example, a bacterium would just absorb oxygen from its surroundings directly through its cell membrane. You've got insects, which have these things called spiracles, actually, which are just like basically holes in the underside of their bodies where oxygen can enter and CO2 can be released. And then we have, of course, fish with their gills, and they're going to be extracting oxygen from water, right? Because the oxygen would be dissolved in the water and then releasing the CO2 back into the water. Since we're larger organisms and we're not those single-celled bacterium that can just absorb gases directly through its cell membrane from its surroundings, we actually need our blood system and our ventilation system in order to oxygenate all of the tissues in our bodies. This slide is very important because it talks about the different muscles involved with ventilation. So you've got your external and internal intercostal muscles, which I was talking about before on this slide, where you have your ribs over here and here, your lungs would be here. This is sort of like a cross-section of your chest cavity or your thorax. And you've got your ribs over here. External intercostal muscles are on the outside, internal intercostal muscles are on the inside. Okay, this is one pair of antagonistic muscles. So what are antagonistic muscles? They are pairs of muscles that work together. Most of your muscles for movement actually work together in some way, and they come in pairs because one muscle will contract and move something in one direction, and then another muscle contracts to move in the opposite direction. Okay, so you've got your external and internal costal muscles. That is one pair of those antagonistic muscles that help you to breathe. When the external intercostals contract, so you can imagine they're on the outside external to your rib cage. When they contract, your rib cage is going to move out and expand. That's going to increase the volume, right, in your thoracic cavity or your thorax or your chest cavity. You can say any one of those words, and that's going to pull out on your rib cage to create a decrease in pressure and pull air into your lungs. Your internal intercostal muscles would be relaxing as your external intercostals are contracting and your rib cage expands outward. When your internal intercostal muscles contract, that's when you're expiring and breathing out. Okay, and then your external intercostals would be relaxed at that time. There's one other pair of muscles, and I already mentioned one of them before. The diaphragm is a part of this pair, and it works with the abdominal muscles. So the diaphragm, when it contracts, you are inspiring, breathing in, right? And it is flattening. The diaphragm flattens and pulls your lungs down so that it creates more volume and a decrease in pressure to bring the air in through your trachea. Okay, and then your abdominal muscles would be relaxing when you're inspiring. Your abdominal muscles are going to be contracting when you're expiring because they help to push back in on your lungs and push the air out of your lungs and decrease the volume and increase the pressure. Here we have a slide just showing the close-up of the alveoli and talking a little bit about its structures in relation to the function of the alveoli. So the membranes of the alveoli are only one cell thick, meaning they're very, very thin. The diffusion path is shorter, which allows for a faster exchange, faster gas exchange. So here we have the alveoli, right? These sort of round sac-like structures, and then we have the membrane that's just one cell thick, and then we have below it a capillary with red blood cells. The red blood cells are picking up the oxygen shown in the blue, and they are dropping off the CO2 into the alveoli, which would then be expired out. The oxygen was inspired into the alveoli. Take a second to think about how many membranes must an oxygen molecule pass through in order to enter an erythrocyte or a red blood cell. You can pause here. The answer would be 5. And the reason being is if this is an oxygen molecule, it has to pass through one side. These are cells, right, lining the alveoli, one cell thick. This is the membrane of the alveoli. And so you've got the oxygen passes through one side of one cell, which is one membrane, and then it has to pass through the other side of that same cell, which is another membrane, so that's 2 membranes so far, and then it has to pass into the capillary and into the red blood cell. So it passes through the other side of the capillary wall cell membrane, and then passes through that same cell's membrane on the other side, and then it passes through one more membrane, which is the red blood cell membrane, and now it is in the erythrocyte. So that's 5 total membranes.